The favorite cliche of American historians, that is to say, historians of American history, is that the genius of America and of our system of government is our ability to compromise. Ken Burns' documentaries on the American Civil War and the Roosevelts featured prominent historians pushing this point like preachers pushing some point of Christian doctrine to their congregations. An unexamined belief in the power of compromise seems to pervade that field of study at all levels. When I was a TA for one American history course, the instructor of record said that America's strength lies in its ability to compromise, and that this is demonstrated by the Compromise of 1877, the corrupt backroom deal that was made which resulted in the premature end of Reconstruction as a gesture of good faith to make up for a stolen election, and a constitutional feature, the Electoral College, which had revealed its fundamental failing. Were we to follow this unreasonable belief in compromise to its logical conclusion, then we would be forced to believe that America's genius lies primarily in its ability to avoid addressing its problems. However, most historians would not go so far. They would, however, call for compromise when the road forward gets bumpy without really taking the time to examine the nature of compromise itself. In this video, I intend to lay out the fundamental nature of a political compromise and show that far from being a cure-all, compromise is actually a very limited tool and just a small part of a much larger process. Before I go into the three examples above and show why the outbreak of the Civil War, the Compromise of 1877, and the passage of the New Deal were not entirely products of compromise and its failure, I will lay out my general argument. For a compromise to occur, the parties involved have to already share an end goal that is similar or the same. A compromise which results in a positive outcome can only come from a scenario where the biggest disagreements are about the means and not the ends. Compromises made without a shared goal are almost always half measures that satisfy no one and keep the source of contention alive. Other compromises are simply agreements that do not change anything, since any potential changes would make things worse in the eyes of both parties. There were successful compromises at the Constitutional Convention, since most of the delegates already agreed with the broad idea of dividing powers between the various branches of government in order to create balance and stability without allowing any one element to establish tyrannical authority. Trying to extrapolate a general principle of compromise from the Constitutional Convention is where the American history model of compromise has erred so grievously. American historians focus far too much on the deals made on the convention floor and far too little on the general circumstances that made those deals possible. In Ken Burns' best-known documentary on the American Civil War, one of the historians present, I believe it was Shelby Foote, attributed the outbreak of the Civil War to the failure of compromise. His face told it all. The impossible had happened, and the magic elixir of compromise, the thing which makes America exceptional and immune from the civil strife which has marred the histories of other nations, failed. The disapproval on his face, naturally, was more of a judgment against the generation of the mid-19th century, who clearly did not understand or appreciate the true power of compromise. Had the politicians of the North and South only seen the value of compromise, then surely the United States could have avoided 4 years of young men in blue and gray coats hurling walls of lead against each other on obscure fields and rural crossroads. Of course, this is a documentary whose opening episode portrays the North as being completely united behind abolitionism, so we shouldn't expect too much. Was the Civil War caused by an inability or unwillingness to compromise? Sort of. Once the South became unwilling to bend on the issue of slavery to the point that they seceded when someone with light abolitionist views assumed the presidency, the war started. However, much of the reason why the previous successful compromises in 1820 and 1850 broke down is that Southern opinion hardened on the issue of slavery leading up to 1860, and the compromises became outdated since they no longer addressed the fundamental concerns of both sides. The danger in making compromises over slavery was twofold. One, it is a fundamental issue that needed to be addressed decisively, as the existence of slavery does not mesh with a modern democratic ideology. And two, slavery is an inherently evil institution, so any compromise that enables it to continue and perpetuate itself is not really a compromise, since the side opposing slavery gets relatively little from the deal, whereas the side that continues to benefit from slave labor wins overwhelmingly. For the Civil War to have been avoided, some kind of emancipation plan would have needed to have been initiated at least a few decades before, and with the approval of at least some Southern states. The failure to act at a reasonably early date allowed unforeseen events to serve as a pretext for Southern slaveholders to rally around the cause of keeping an entire race of people subservient. In 1831, after the Nat Turner Revolt, many Virginians asked their state assembly to address the issue of slavery. While many of the petitioners asked for slavery to be preserved, others did request emancipation. Still others wanted to banish free blacks from the state, presumably to avoid inspiring slaves to better their lives. The point is that, as late as 1831, Southerners were willing to entertain a discussion on the possibility of abolition. At some point not too long after that year, Southerners would view such a discussion as a Yankee conspiracy to take away their liberty. The irony was completely lost on the men making the argument that they were worried about their own liberty when they were owning other human beings. Had Douglas won the presidency, or had Lincoln managed to make a compromise which satisfied the South, how he would have done that I can only guess, then it is likely that this compromise would have held for no longer than a single presidential term. Southern opinion had reached a point where they would not accept a single unfavorable law or a chief executive who was perhaps secretly hostile to their peculiar institution. Compromises in 1820 and 1850 had avoided war and had some merit, but at the end of the day, neither compromise had addressed the fundamental questions which made those compromises necessary in the first place. The most absurd example of a compromise that some American historians hold up as a shining example for our nation's genius for compromise is the Compromise of 1877. The crisis began when, in 1876, there was an election where the popular vote went to Democrat Samuel Tilden, but the Electoral College went to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. There were widespread accusations of cheating and rigging that were leveled against Hayes, who quickly earned the nickname Rutherfraud. In early 1877, an agreement was reached whereby Reconstruction was ended in the few remaining southern states where it was still going on, which left the Republican state governments in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina ripe for the picking. In other words, the Democrats quit contesting the presidency in exchange for the eventual control of a few southern state governments. The group that was left in the lurch were Southern blacks who were no longer subject to federal protection. In the 1890s, a new generation of Southern politicians would emerge and institute Jim Crow to disenfranchise black voters in the name of fighting corruption. Just like voter ID laws, which are putatively designed to fight voter fraud and corruption, Jim Crow was officially sold to the public as a measure against corruption, but in reality was all about taking away civil rights from the black community in the South. In Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelts, one of the experts who was interviewed said that FDR's genius and the thing that enabled him to institute Social Security was his skill for compromise. I don't recall who the expert was, but I do recall that George Will was fobbed off as an expert during his documentary, which is a crime against the words expert and scholar. At any rate, the documentary vastly overrates the role that compromise played in creating the New Deal signature legislation. The thing which enabled the passage of Social Security and other New Deal legislation is that FDR won the battle for public opinion and had built up a formidable political coalition. By winning public opinion, FDR shaped the debate and put conservative Democrats and Republicans on the defensive. They felt they could only safely oppose FDR's agenda by sniping at it around the margins, but that the public backlash from obstructionism would be too severe, so they limited themselves to demanding relatively small compromises. The only major concession, which is shameful, is that professions which tended to be majority black were not covered by the original Social Security legislation. As for FDR's political coalition, his odds of passing things were always good, and he didn't have to sell his soul every time that he wanted to adjust a tax rate by 0.0001% or do some other minor tweak to government operations. This fetish with compromise is a direct result of Clintonism, a model of politics which has failed and is dying before our eyes. The thesis of Bill Clinton and his acolytes is that we should move beyond right and left and instead seek a third way built around compromise. The problem is that this so-called third way brings about this compromise by having the Democrats cave into the basic economic assumptions of the Republicans from the outset of any political debate. Rather than debating how the economy should work or who it should work for, the Democrats agree with Republicans that corporate interests and the wealthy should take precedence. After that point, debate is limited to the minutiae of exactly how fast the middle class should be destroyed. The Republicans, as evidenced by the Trump tax bill, want to eliminate the middle class immediately, whereas the Democrats, champions of the people, want the middle class to ride into the sunset over the course of a few decades. Of course, there are some disagreements over social issues that the Clinton model allows for, but those issues are little more than distractions most of the time, especially since legislating morality is literally impossible. If you are an actual member of the left, then it is clear that the goal of Clintonian neoliberalism is not big C compromise in some elevated Enlightenment sense, but rather economic inequality and the dominance of special interest over the people, but with a smile. Whether we're debating the politics of the past or the present, we need to remember that compromise is not a cure-all, and that not all compromises are created equally. Compromises can be the answer, but they also can prolong problems. Seeking a compromise early and often is not the epitome of statesmanship. It simply points to a lack of understanding of the political process and history.